Well, welcome back, everyone. We are going to get started the session 3 now. The first speaker of this session is Dr. Thomas Sobotka from Vienna Institute of Demography. He is also affiliated with Wittgenstein Center for Demography and Global Human Capital. Dr. Sobotka is an international scholar of repute and currently serves as a council member for IPS, European Association for Population Studies. And he has worked on a broad range of topics related to fertility and family change. And this afternoon, he's going to talk about the population changes in Europe during the COVID-19 pandemic, dealing with cross-country patterns of fertility, mortality, and migration, and you name it. Now, please join me in welcoming Dr. Sobotka.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Kim, and thank you also to Yeonjeong and Kihaza for organizing this meeting and for inviting me. I'm sorry that I came late, so you have to listen to my talk now instead of in the morning. And differently from the speakers in the past session who went very much into detail of what happened with population mobility, fertility intentions, and family, I will give you a very broad picture about European demographic trends. So if you are interested in more detail, you can then ask, and especially about fertility, I can keep talking and talking, but here we have a high-speed kind of broad picture presentation where I don't have much time for many details. So, of course, no surprise, the coronavirus pandemic had a multifaceted impact on population trends. The direct impact, I don't need to comment on it, very clear. Mortality rates increased in many countries, especially during the waves of the pandemic. And we observe quite a number of excess deaths and higher mortality rates, which I think these were also discussed in the morning session. More difficult to capture and discuss is the indirect impact of the pandemic. And it's also difficult to slice down the reasons and the mechanisms how the pandemic influences fertility behavior, migrations, family-related behaviors. How much of that is because of the government policies, especially the health-related policies such as lockdowns, social distancing measures, later on vaccinations, all kinds of other mobility restrictions, but also government economic and social policies which were reacting to the economic impact of the pandemic or trying to support vulnerable population groups and families during the pandemic times. Then there were a lot of institutional adjustments which also differed by countries, such as a shift to online schooling for many months in many years, and more shift to remote work rather than in-person work in the offices. And also there were individual responses and adjustments. So people themselves changing their behaviors, social contacts, intimate lives, making health-related decisions, making labor market decisions, reducing their mobility or not reducing their mobility in some places. So this is all difficult to distinguish. I'm just mentioning it here, and we can return to some of these things in the discussion as well. And as you will see later on, there were huge differences in how pandemic influences population trends across the European continent. So sometimes it's very difficult to generalize. Now, to start with, I want to mention a few words about the pre-pandemic trends, which are also important for understanding the pandemic trends themselves. So in most of Europe, fertility rates were pretty low already before the pandemic and often declining. So even in the higher fertility parts in Europe, such as the Nordic countries, fertility rates were typically declining between the economic recession around 2008 to 12 and the start of the pandemic. However, compared to Korea, European fertility rates are quite high, even in very low fertility countries in Europe. So everything has to be taken from a perspective. Mortality rates were strongly differentiated by region in Europe. So especially the Eastern European countries and Southeastern European countries, the post-communist parts of Europe and the poorer parts of Europe had higher mortality rates as well as bigger life expectancy gap between women and men, with a big mortality disadvantage for men. Most European regions saw slowing mortality improvements during the 2010s. So mortality was still improving in general, but these rates of improving life expectancy were slowing down in many places before the pandemic. And in terms of immigration, there are two main trends which I want to mention. Overall, Europe has received significant immigration, both within the continent, but also with countries from outside the continent. But then on the top of that, Europe is pretty much divided again alongside the Eastern Europe, Southeastern Europe versus the rest of Europe axis. There's a lot of migration happening actually within Europe from poorer parts of Europe, especially in the East and Southeast. People moving to get jobs, better salaries, and better chances in life to the richer parts of Europe. So many parts of Europe had out-migration in the pre-pandemic times, and many parts of, even more parts of Europe had immigration. And you can see the contrast on this map, which shows the total population change in Europe in the pre-pandemic period until 2019. And all the yellow and red parts were losing population, and the green colored countries were having population increases. And I want to emphasize these colors don't correspond to fertility rates. So these differences in population increases or declines in Europe were pretty much driven by migration, and only in the second place by fertility rates. Now let me move towards the pandemic impact. When discussing the pandemic impact on population trends, one has to distinguish the expected timing when things start changing. Of course, immediate impact of mortality rate. So the first date when Europe was declared as an epicenter of the pandemic was 13 March 2020. So this is when we observed the first wave of the pandemic in Europe, and when we observed immediately, of course, in many countries, especially in Spain, Italy, and then later on in some Western European countries, increasing death rates and mortality related to the pandemic. Migration is very much related to national lockdowns and border closures, which again happen very quickly, especially in spring, and were very much concentrated into the first wave of the pandemic from March to May 2020. So this was the largest reduction of mobility in Europe, with many governments almost completely shutting down the borders. With respect to birth and fertility rates, of course, there is this duration of pregnancy, on average 8.7 months is the time from conception to delivery. So we expect that the first months when the pandemic influences birth trends is in November 2020. So less than 9 months after the pandemic outbreak in March, and less than 9 months after all the lockdowns in Europe started. So let me show you something about the fertility trends. Together with my colleagues from the Vienna Institute and the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research, we are working with monthly birth data for 36 highly developed countries, out of which about 25 are in Europe. And we have data up to some period in 2022, typically until April, May 2022, not for all countries. We look at the relative changes in births, in the number of births compared to the pre-pandemic months, to have some control over the seasonality, but we also go one step further and we compute gross fertility rates and make an estimate, crude estimate of monthly total fertility rates. Crude because we don't have age distribution of births, and we have only estimated distribution of the total population for the latest months and for the most recent year. You can get much more details in an overview paper we have publicly available. The interesting thing about births is that if you look at the media, there were speculations in both directions. There were speculations that people will suddenly have too much time at home and they will produce more babies, because what else to do at home than having some fun and have more babies? And of course, there were completely opposite speculations. And I think most demographers, most of us researchers were on the opposite side of these expectations, thinking that all the economic uncertainties and pandemic-related uncertainties will make many people refraining from making long-term decisions and essentially postponing their childbearing decisions. Now, the story is more complicated, as I will show you in a moment, but on the whole, on average, when we look, for instance, at the year 2021, which was fully affected already by the pandemic, the birth trends didn't change dramatically on average, but you see some differentiation across Europe, with some countries having declining numbers of births in that year, and some countries having an increase in the number of births, such as Belgium, the Netherlands, the Nordic countries, but also France, Central European countries, and Britain. So the full picture is not a picture of such a big changes, but when we look at the monthly trends, we see a lot of changes in individual countries, but not necessarily at the same time. If you look at the monthly numbers of births adjusted for seasonality and the number of days in a month and weekdays, this is the fat line, and the gray line in the background is the observed number of births, non-adjusted. If you look at Spain, you see a huge drop associated with the start of the pandemic. In December 2020, January 21, birth rates went down very strongly by about 19-20% for just 2 months. And then they went back more or less to the trajectory which was there before the pandemic. If you look at Germany, that's the second picture. The picture is very different. Overall, the number of births increased slightly during most of the pandemic until January 22. When comes January 22, things go dramatically down, and we can later discuss why. I will show you this happened in many more countries than just in Germany. So when you follow these monthly trends in the number of births in different parts of Europe, and this is compared to the pre-pandemic period, so the same month before the start of the pandemic, meaning November 2019 to October 2020 are the comparison months. In some places, like in Finland, you can see clear traces of a baby boom throughout all the pandemic period. These are the blue bars. But then this picture changes around January 22, and the number of births starts dropping. But we see also the opposite extreme. Portugal had a decline in the number of births throughout the whole pandemic period. And a more typical picture is what you see for Hungary. You see waves. You see waves of births going down during the first wave, that's around January 21, then again at the start of this year, and in between you see some very tiny baby booms for a couple of months, which first of them was associated with the end of the first wave of the pandemic. The later ones are more interesting. This occurred already in the middle of the pandemic and even during some waves of the coronavirus. Now, to show you that quite a number of countries had this big decline in the number of births around January 22, which is a kind of small mystery for us to explain because we didn't expect it. You see picture of Sweden, Germany, Czechia with quite similar trends actually in the course of the pandemic. Some increases during the pandemic, initial declines in Sweden, not so much in Germany, and then a big decline in 2022. We made a projection where we projected the trajectory of births based on pre-pandemic trends, just to see whether the pandemic trends really diverged from the confidence interval, which would be predicted based on the pre-pandemic trends. So for Spain, you clearly see these few initial months of the pandemic when the birth trends are significantly below anything which was projected, but then after that, Spain is pretty much within the trajectory which was projected. Germany, in contrast, keeps pretty much within the trajectory except for the start of the year 2022. So again, quite different cross-country patterns. To make the long story shorter, when we look at the significant ups and downs during the pandemic, we see a lot of similarities between countries. The first wave, typically significant declines. There's the orange colored months around January 2020, declining trends almost everywhere. But then comes the recovery from March 21, sometimes sustained, sometimes lasting just 1 or 2 months. And then declines. I didn't color all these declines we have in 2022. I didn't update this picture. So we translated these trends also in total fertility rates. I think I don't have much time to discuss them in detail, but even when you translate these trends into total fertility rates, you see these ups and downs during the pandemic, which differ a lot between countries, with some countries having baby boom and then a bust in 2022, the Netherlands or Finland. Some countries having a lot of fluctuations like Hungary, and some countries having only the initial baby bust at the start of the pandemic during the first wave, and then went back to where they were before the pandemic, like Spain or Italy. This is how it looks when you look at individual months, and you see a lot of quite significant fluctuations in total fertility rates from 1 month to the next, with the differences up to 0.25 in absolute terms in total fertility rates, especially when we account for the year 2022. So during the pandemic in a country like Czechia, we saw the TFR shooting up to 1.84 or even above, and then going down early this year to 1.6. So really quite big differences. Also in Germany. One more trend I want to mention about fertility rates. When we look at fertility rates by age, and I think that will be a similar picture in Korea, we see that especially among young people, younger women, fertility dropped a lot during the pandemic. But the older age groups, above 30, had quite some recovery, accelerating increase in the number of births during the pandemic, which shows that the women who were having babies during the pandemic are typically women at older childbearing ages. And in many European countries, these were women having their second kid, not the first one, but second or third. So typically, women who are in a better economic position, better educated, staying at home, kind of enjoying, if I may use that word, their home office work, and taking this time when they had little opportunities for social contact and for social life outside home to have another child with their partner. Now, I understand you discussed quite a bit about mortality in the morning, so let me just mention that there were huge differences in excess death across Europe and over time. Apparently, these excess deaths were overlapping with the waves of the pandemic, but they measure the true toll of the pandemic much better than the registered COVID-19 death, because some countries were very poor in registering who was sick with the coronavirus and making sure who died of the coronavirus. You can see it on the right-hand picture for Russia. When you compare excess mortality rates in Russia or excess deaths in Russia, these are the red lines with the reported COVID-19 death. These are the blue-grayish area below the red lines. You see a really huge difference, especially during the peaks of the coronavirus waves. So excess deaths are much better, provide much better pictures of the true toll of the pandemic. The officially estimated COVID-19 deaths, 2 million in Europe, but the excess deaths from 1st January to 20 are about 3.5 million, so almost double, which means about 0.5% of all European population has passed away directly or indirectly because of the coronavirus pandemic from the start of the pandemic until today, which is a little bit better than or comparable to Latin America. And this is much worse record than, for instance, in Asia. But the picture within Europe is very, very differentiated. There are countries which have seen almost no excess death. For instance, in 2021, Belgium had almost no excess deaths. Iceland has almost no excess deaths. The Nordic countries, very little excess deaths. On the other scale of these extremes were Albania, Montenegro, Slovakia, Bulgaria, with about 40% excess deaths above the normal number of deaths, in a normal year before the pandemic, 2019. And the same can be seen when you look at the trends in life expectancy for women and men. Very, very little impact of the pandemic in a place like Finland, where essentially there is a flat trend in life expectancy in the last 2 years between 2019 and 2021. 1 year drop in Spain and some recovery in 21. So Spain was the early pandemic country, very strongly affected in the first wave. But then we have a lot of countries where the declining trend in life expectancy accelerated in the year 2021. You see Czechia, where life expectancy dropped by about 2 years, erasing all the gains in life expectancy in the previous decade. But we have even bigger extremes. So this picture shows different countries, about 10 selected countries by sex. In Bulgaria and Russia, life expectancy dropped by about 4 years in the 2 pandemic years. It dropped typically more for men than for women, which also means that the gaps in life expectancy by sex have increased, but also that the gaps between best performing and worst performing countries in Europe has widened. Russia in 2021, Russian men had 17 years lower life expectancy than men in some Nordic countries. And this is really a big extreme. So you see that mortality in Europe is really hugely differentiated by country and also by gender. This picture shows that on average, the male-female gap in life expectancy increased during the pandemic because men were hit harder by the pandemic and were dying more frequently because of the coronavirus infection than women. I skip the next picture. This picture suggests that part of the differentiation in death rates across Europe was due to vaccination, but not until the late part of the last year. So vaccination was not associated with death trends until summer 2021, and only in autumn and winter last year did it start making a difference for cross-country mortality rates. Let me mention a few things about migration and then I conclude because I'm taking too much time already. Most countries saw a temporary slowdown in immigration. Of course, that would be expected because of the lockdowns and associated measures, which means that the trends between immigration and outmigration often resulted in a smaller net migration population gain in many of these countries, but only during the first pandemic year, 2020. And often in 2021, situation was back, or countries were back in immigration where they were before. You can see this picture month by month for the Netherlands, that really this drop in registered immigration was sharpest during the year 2020, and then during 2021, the Netherlands went back to where it was before. And now we have the Ukrainian crisis. So, of course, the immigration is huge to many parts of Europe because of the influx of Ukrainian migrants. And I also want to mention one thing about internal migration, because that relates also to these discussions about mobility within cities and city districts, which we have discussed before. On this picture of Germany, you can see that the coronavirus pandemic has accelerated the shift of people leaving big cities and moving towards rural areas. The fact that many people could work from home made them leaving urban areas, buying bigger houses in the countryside, and maybe commuting 1 day a week when they need to be in the office to the cities, to their offices. So to summarize, for birth and fertility, we observe distinct waves, small booms and busts in many countries, with clear fluctuations, with huge shifts in monthly TFRs, and an accelerated trend towards later timing of birth, surprising falls in births around January 2022 and in the subsequent months. For death and mortality, we observe huge differences between countries, with sometimes large falls in life expectancy and excess mortality, especially among males. And we see a temporary break in immigration. What does it mean for broader population trends? For broader population trends, if I simplify the story, it means that there are widening disparities in population trends across Europe. Countries which used to have relatively good population balance before the pandemic suffered less from the pandemic in terms of death consequences and had only a temporary interruption of immigration. For instance, the Western European countries and the Nordic countries. So not much impact of the pandemic, but the pandemic hit hard, especially the Eastern, Southeastern European countries, which were already suffering from depopulation and outmigration. And now they suffer also from excess mortality rates and sometimes declining number of births. I have some slides about future outlook. I save some time by not discussing them. You can read some of these speculations and we can discuss them also during the debate session. Thank you very much. And many of these things are also shown in our European demographic data sheet. If you want to have another copy or the previous copy, I think some of them are still here on the table. You can pick them up. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was very much impressed that you managed to present enormous amount of data and materials in a very short time, and let us have a kind of bird's eye view of the population change during the pandemic. Just a short question. Does Hinterland means suburb or what? It's in Germany, right? Hinterland. But it's not rural area. Okay. Yeah. I have just minor comments about your findings that excess mortality was higher for males and that there was a widening gender gap in life expectation. They seem to be a little bit contradictory to the findings from the analysis of Korean data. I'm not sure whether he has some explanation, but I would be very grateful if Thomas or Dr. Bongoh Kye or both of you say a few words about this distinctive findings during the discussion session. Okay. Now we move on from Europe to Korea, and our next speaker is Dr. Yoon Jung-shin. I don't know whether she needs my introduction, but anyway, she's a senior research fellow at KIASA, and she's been very active in conducting international joint product, and her research mainly focuses on low fertility, family, gender, childcare. Did I miss anything? Anyway, the title of her presentation today is Fertility Change After COVID-19 in Korea. Dr. Shin, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Professor Kim, for introducing me. The title of my presentation is Fertility Changes During the Pandemic in Korea. In the past year, one of the top news in the world was, of course, the spread of COVID-19. And next to the COVID-19, I think that Korea's TFR supplied the world, and because the TFR of Korea was 0.81 in 2021, and it broke its one record for the lowest fertility in the world. I think all of three Korean presenters have the same graph, and I think this graph shows very well the progress of COVID-19 in Korea. And the number of cases in COVID-19 in Korea enormously increased in the fourth wave and the fifth wave when the Delta mutation and the Omicron mutation spread. But actually, the step-by-step recovery to the normal life started from these fourth waves and first wave. And actually, people's fear for the pandemic was greater in the first waves of the pandemic, like in the first waves and second wave. Korean government officially recognized the COVID-19 pandemic from January 2020 to April 2022 And during this period, COVID-19 went through 4 major waves. And during the pandemic, I think there are a lot of changes. There has been a lot of changes in Korean society, and many scholars conducted researches on the changes in family relationships and the lives of young people. And they found that there were more stress due to changes in family and overall life dynamics. And women got more economic impact than men and performed more unpaid care work and felt more isolation. And gender inequality and conflict have deepened since the spread of COVID-19. And industries employing the youth population got hardest hit, and youth employment conditions significantly deteriorated. And during the spread of COVID-19, the demographers, including me and our colleagues, worried about the TFR of Korea, because we think that due to the shock of COVID-19, our TFR decreased enormously. And we conducted a survey very similar to what Professor Choi did. And we found that, of course, there were not much people change their desire to have a birth, like to give a birth, and they do not much change their plan to have a birth. But we found that around 30% of married women reported they changes their childbearing desire and plans. And this is I think a little bit higher percentage than what Professor Choi did, because we did this survey in the June 2020. And I believe Professor Choi did the survey a little bit later in 2021. As I said, the fear for the COVID-19 was greater in the initial stage of the spread of COVID-19. There was UN expert meeting. I think Thomas was there. Thomas was in there. So they expect that the TFR temporary decrease due to tempo and the quantum effect in the 2021 and 2022. And they said that TFR converged to pre-pandemic trend starting from the 2023 until 2025. And they said that eventually the impact on the pandemic on TFR will be negligible. So then, what will be the Korea's TFR after the COVID-19? And it will unfold as predicted by UN experts. This is my research questions. What were the features of fertility rate in Korea during the spread of COVID-19? Did fertility-related indicators follow that trend, or they will exhibit different patterns? Do the changes in pandemic-era birth rate differ by socio-economic group? And compared to other countries, what are the characteristics of changes in the number of births in Korea? And in what direction Korea's fertility rate likely to develop after the COVID-19 pandemic? For my analysis, I used data from viral statistics on fertility and marriage. And I mainly did descriptive analysis, and I looked at the changes in number of births, compare number of births and the number of marriages compared to the same months of the previous year. For the international comparison, I also used the human fertility data from the Human Fertility Database, which Thomas and his colleague developed, and I used data from Japan, Spain, Italy, Czech Republic, Germany, Spain, and Sweden. And this is my finding for the fertility changes in 2021. Unfortunately, and contrast to what we worried about, there's no significant decrease in the number of births or TFR in 2021 in Korea. The number of births decreased about 4.3, and the TFR decreased by about 3.6% compared to the previous year. And these are relatively small decrease compared to the prior drops, because in the past there are huge decline of TFR and the number of births in Korea. And the rate of change in the number of births, I found that 9 months following the arrival of a major COVID waves, the number of births decreased a lot. And it means that anyway, the major waves of COVID-19 affect the people's childbearing activities. In October, November 2020, we can see that there are huge decline in the number of births. And I think this is due to the impact of a first wave in January 2020. And then we can see another drop in the number of births in December 2021. And I think this is due to the impact of a third wave in January 2021. And lastly, the last June 2022, you had another big drop in the number of births. And I think this is due to the impact of the Delta wave, which was in July 2021. And I look at the rate of change in the number of births by subgroups. And let's look at the comparison by first orders. And I found that severe pandemic impact on the number of second and third births. And I think this is a very similar trend in the past year. But during the pandemic, I found that impact on the first birth was notable, and the recovery of second and third birth was faster than the recovery of the first birth. And the number of births by women in their 20s decreased a lot, but the number of births by women over 40 increased. And of course, this is the same trend in the past, but when you look at the trend in the past, the differences by age group is very small. But during the pandemic, you can see there are huge differences by age groups. And let's look at the rate of change by level of education of a mother. Women with lower level of education experienced a greater reduction in the number of births than women with higher education. And the recovery in the number of births by women with low-level education was slow than the women in the higher education. And let's look at the rate of change by the occupation of mother. I think this is very important findings. When we look at the trend in the past, we can see that the number of births for women in sales and services increases compared to the previous years. But during the pandemic, the trend is changing. The number of births for women in sales and services decreased. I think that this is because that women in services and sales are essential workers. They have to work with people face to face, and they cannot work they cannot do any telework, and they cannot work at home. So I think they have more fear for the infections of virus, and they felt more impact of social distancing measures, and they may more hesitant to have children. And let's look at the marriage changes in 2020 and 2021. The number of marriages fell by more in 2020 and 2021 than it has since the early 2010s. And average age at first marriage for women rose by 0.5 years since 2019. And the rate of change in the number of marriage far exceeds the average rate of decline over the past decade. And we can see that several periods show the highest decline in the marriage in 10 years. Okay, and this is the international comparison. And Thomas already explained very detailed about the European story. So I will mainly focus on the comparison between Korea and other countries. And I found that most countries experienced an unprecedented decline in the number of births to record low and drop in the number of births at least 10% steeper compared to previous year. And this is a common feature between Korea and other countries. But there is differences. Birth rate in some countries rebounded after initial decline. But East Asian countries with ultra low fertility rate, such as Korea and Japan, did not show any bounce back. Okay, let's look at the previous chart. I'm sorry. Oh my God. Okay. I'm sorry for the interruption. Okay. I'm sorry for the technical problem. Okay. Oh, wonderful. Okay. Okay, great. Okay, let's look at the graph again. For the chart of Spain, Italy, and other European countries, we can see that at the initial stage, the number of births declined, and then there are some increases in number of births. But for Korea and Japan, we couldn't find any rebounds of the number of births. And this is the conclusion of my study. Amid the spread of COVID-19, both the number of births and TFR of Korea did not show a significant drop. It just maintained the ongoing decline trend. And this result is the contrast with the survey result on childbirth desire and planning, which we conducted at the initial stage of COVID-19, COVID wave. So, I think why the people actually not. There are some people that said that their desire to give birth and their desire for the childbirth is declined, but actually the TFR of Korea did not much decrease. And why? And the reason is, I think we should talk about this more about this in the discussion sessions. And I think that childbirth is very serious, very result of a very serious decision-making process. And I think only people who have decided, who have decision, people make very difficult decisions. So they are very reluctant to change their plans, especially for the Korean situations. So that means only people who have serious thinking about their childbirth can have a child. And this is my speculation, but we need to talk more about this. But the number of marriages declined to an unprecedented levels. So I guess the number of births and TFR may continue to decline over the next 2 or 3 years. So fertility in Korea is likely to unfold in a different direction from what was presented at the UN expert meeting. And there was no significant decline in TFR in 2021, but I think there should be additional decrease in TFR in the near future. And the decrease in the number of births by subgroup generally maintained the prior trend. But during the period of COVID-19, group disparities clearer than ever, and the recovery in the number of births among the vulnerable group was slower than people with some other peoples. And the decrease the number of births born in group affected by social distancing measures, like women in services or sales, was relatively large. While Korea exhibited some features in common with other countries, it diverged in several aspects. The decrease in number of births in Korea was larger than other countries, and there was no rebound in the number of births in Korea. And that is all of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Shin, for your well-organized presentation with various graphs on the recent changes and differentials in the number of births and marriages. It was also good to see your summary of findings on fertility change in selected countries and confirm his result just shown earlier this afternoon. We now have come to the final presentation, which will be made by Professor Young-Nong Kim. He is assistant professor at Kuan University. He's a geographer, and his research focuses on urban economy, virtual space, big data. This afternoon, Dr. Kim is going to talk about population mobility in this whole metropolitan area after COVID-19. Dr. Kim, go ahead, please.
Yes. Yeah, thank you for your kind introduction, Professor Kim. I also really appreciate Dr. Shin and all KIASA members with organizing this wonderful seminar. As I would just introduce, my background spans from economics and geography to big data research. And one of my recent research topics is human mobility, particularly based on big data collected on a real-time basis. This means that what I will talk about today is human mobility in everyday life, like travel for work, school, and shopping, rather than migration. So in this presentation, I'd like to show you how COVID-19 changed population mobility in everyday life in the Seoul metropolitan area. In particular, intercity population mobility that you might just got familiar after Dr. Sunyong's presentation. Okay, let me begin with the big question that motivated me to conduct this research. Since the pandemic hit the cities around the world, one of the key questions for researchers in cities and regions was this. Is the urban density an enemy in the fight against the pandemic? The logic was very simple. More people, more contagion, and more infection. So New York City and large metropolitan areas showed more confirmed cases and higher death rate in the first wave of the pandemic than rural areas. I believe Seoul and its metropolitan area was not an exception. The greater Seoul area accounts for half of the population in South Korea, but more than 3/4 of the confirmed cases came out from the region. But on the other hand, there was empirical evidence that urban density was not correlated to the number of confirmed cases in Chinese cities. Another notable approach is on the intercity connectivity. High urban density doesn't literally mean that everyone is bunched together, shoulder to shoulder. It rather means that high population density increases the possibility and frequency of contacts and interactions in cities. Building on the point, this article in Nature investigated the population outflow from Wuhan as the main factor of the distribution of COVID-19. And on the right panel, this Economist magazine tried to show that the interconnectedness of cities is positively correlated to the number of confirmed cases. So in this presentation, I'd like to show how I applied this network approach to the Seoul metropolitan area and investigate the change in the population flow. So how can we empirically investigate the population flow, intercity connectivity, and coronavirus? Some alternative concepts to residential population are such as living population, de facto population, and service population. Actually, they were raised several decades ago already, but their measurement had many limits. But in the last decade, the rise of big data brought life to those concepts. So one of the big data I used is population mobility big data, collected based on the real-time location of cell phone activities provided by Korea Telecom. And this data can be also transformed into network data as subscribers' billing addresses and real-time locations are understood as their origins and destinations. When it comes to my study area, the origin information of population flow was aggregated at the cities and districts, 지군구 level, and destination at the neighborhood, in Korean, 인구변동 level. And if I give you a very short geographical background, the city of Seoul in the center is surrounded by Gyeonggi province, and those two regions make the Seoul metropolitan area together with more than 20 million population. So to begin with the overview of the living population in Seoul, this calendar shows a sharp decrease in living population right after the first wave in late February 2020. The ratio of population inflow from other regions to Seoul dropped from about 14% to at the lowest level like 11.4%. Then it recovered over the several months, but the second wave brought a similar sharp decrease in the August. On the other hand, Gyeonggi province, which is the outskirt of Seoul, showed a population increase. If we compare the daily living population of Gyeonggi and Seoul in blue and red, they are basically symmetrical, mainly because hundreds of thousands of people commute from Gyeonggi to Seoul. Before the pandemic, the gap between Gyeonggi and Seoul was very narrow on weekdays. However, the gap suddenly widened after the first wave, and the trend kept going. And the second wave further broadened the gap. So I would say that the new normal trend implies that people in Gyeonggi go into Seoul not as much as before the pandemic. Then I apply the network approach to the population mobility. In other words, the origin and destination information of cell phone activities were transformed into network data and aggregated at the level of neighborhoods. So if the overall patterns before and after the first wave are compared, the dense network in Seoul was loosened due to the pandemic. If I look into the population inflow to some notable places, like the three city centers of Seoul, Gangnam, Jongno, and Yeouido, population inflow from not only other neighborhoods and other districts from Seoul, but also from many satellite cities in Gyeonggi area significantly decreased. So, based on the exploratory analysis shown so far, I went back to one of my big questions. So, is urban density an enemy in the fight against the pandemic? In my opinion, rather than blaming urban density, I suggest thinking this way. The pandemic is a catalyst that accelerates the slow change we already faced in the 21st century. So in this quote, as Bart stated, there is a balance between two opposing forces, centripetal and centrifugal forces in cities. And those two forces can be also translated to more conventional debate, like centralization versus decentralization, or concentration versus dispersion. I think it also goes in line with what Dr. Shin asked to Dr. In the previous session. So the centripetal force means that job opportunity, innovation, urban amenity, and urban vitality attract people to come into cities. On the other hand, pollution, traffic, crime, and high rent make people move out of cities. In addition to that, information and communication technology allowed remote working since the late 20th century. But the thing is that the transition in the real world has been very, very slow. Then, boom, COVID-19. The pandemic suddenly put us in a great social experiment of flexible working in terms of space and time. If so, an important question would be, what kind of new factors in terms of centripetal and centrifugal forces are significant in the post-COVID city? So in my empirical model, our economic complexity and flexible working were tested as the new factors of centripetal and centrifugal forces, respectively. On the one hand, building on Hidalgo's idea of economic complexity, I calculated a complexity index for every neighborhood in my study area using the number of firms by industrial sectors. On the other hand, the flexible working adoption rate was transformed to the flexibility index to represent a new factor of the centrifugal force in the post-COVID city. Then, here's a quick summary of the regression analysis, including complexity index, flexibility index, and other variables. First, the dependent variable is a change in population inflow, which means that post-COVID population flow minus pre-COVID population flow. So in other words, a positive value means an increase in population inflow after the first wave of COVID-19. And one of my base assumptions underlying the fixed effect model is that population mobility follows the gravity model, which includes the number of employees of origin and destination and the geographical distance between regions. And I'd like to show three main findings. First, the complexity index was shown positively significant. This means that the variety and complexity of economic activities contributed to an increase in population inflow over the pandemic. Second, the flexibility index was found negatively significant. This finding implies that the possibility of flexible working can work as a centrifugal force that suppressed population inflow to regions. Third, a dummy variable, which indicates someone's origin and destination were in the same region, shows that population flow over a short distance within the same region increased. Okay, so far I focus on the short-term change in population mobility over the first wave of COVID-19. Then I've been working on the long-term effect of pandemic up to 2022. Yes, I brought the same figure in English. Yes, I found one, right. Okay, according to Korean Disease Control and Prevention Agency, 질병관리청, there were 5 periods over the 2.5 years. So I selected a specific month to represent each period. For example, August 2021 for period 4 of Delta variant and April 2022 for period 5 of Omicron variant. And in addition to the 5 periods, I put 2 more pre-COVID and post-COVID periods. So in total, 7 months or 7 periods. Okay, so if I set the level of population mobility in the pre-COVID period as a base, 1.0, this diagram shows the general trend of the change in the everyday mobility in the Seoul metropolitan area. So right after the first outbreak, population mobility suddenly decreased to 73% level compared to the base months. Then it recovered a little bit, but another dispersion and rigorous social distancing measures brought it to a much lower level, to 68%. And in the late February 2021, first vaccination began in South Korea. If I recall correctly, I was first vaccinated in June, and September 2021 was the point when 70% of people got vaccinated. So this was reflected in the increasing trend in the population mobility in period, where's my cursor? Yeah, in period 4 in August 2021. And despite Omicron variant and the explosive increase of confirmed cases, the Korean government mitigated social distancing measures in last April. And that was the time when the mobility level already recovered to the level of that before the pandemic. And here are some other interesting findings from a comparison across travel purposes. As I asked to Dr. I was also very curious about how we can understand their purposes for travel using this big data. So this is not perfect. So yeah, I'm still welcoming your comments on the method for the estimation. So let me introduce the logic. So based on the times of cell phone activities were detected, their daytime and nighttime regions can be estimated. Then we can assume that, for example, for this first case, population mobility from nighttime to daytime regions would be mainly the essential type of travel, like travel from home to work or from home to work to schools. So in that case, it did not decrease as much as the total mobility did. So I think working from home contributed to the decrease in mobility partially, but most people had to go to work anyway. And the second case is from nighttime regions to other regions, which means regions other than daytime or nighttime regions. So I think this type of travel represent the unessential type of travel for shopping and leisure purposes. And it showed much bigger decrease than the essential type of travel. And the third case is on the activities in the neighborhoods. So people didn't get around in their neighborhoods during the COVID years, but it increased way much than the pre-COVID level to 1.28. It indicates that one of the new normal trend in the post-COVID city is that people prefer short-distance trip within their neighborhoods to long-distance travel to, for example, to Jongno and Gangnam, for example. And the last one suggests activities after work, like group dinner and social drinking. The lowest level of 0.6 in period 3 implies that the harsh social distancing measures, like no social gathering over 2 persons or curfew after 9 p.m. in the period. So let me conclude. The main contribution of my research is that the new factors of the centripetal and centrifugal forces are suggested, and the change in the balance between them was investigated by population mobility big data. But I like to also warn that this kind of living population big data can be problematic for investigating long-term change because there are so many factors that bring population inflow. For example, urban redevelopment, renewal, and regeneration projects can bring thousands of people in a month or two. And that is one reason why I'm still hesitated to put my long-term analysis in a more rigorous way. And lastly, I hope this type of research can support an evidence-based policy-making process. So to avoid dilemma among public health, economy, and liberty, micro-scale social distancing measures should be designed for future disease based on the deeper investigation of population mobility over the COVID years. Okay. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I think it was a great idea to present a framework of centripetal and centrifugal forces explaining population inflows and outflows throughout the pandemic period. Dr. Kim, I do have a small methodological comment on your regression model. I would like to point out that the independent and control variables, if you have,
Yes.
in your regression model are kinds of stock measures at time point t, while the dependent variable is a flow measure at t plus 1 point in time. And it may lead to kinds of overestimation of coefficients of the key independent variables. And I think by adding a stock measure of dependent variable at t point in time in your regression model, you can, reduce the kinds of bias or avoid this kinds of estimation. That's my comment. Okay.
Thank you.
Now we have listened to all the three presentations of this session, and I would like to invite Thomas for comment and questions. You can make comment and questions on two presentations, and if you really wish, you can make your own comment on your presentation as well.
No, just on the two presentations. so I have the funny task of making comments on the session where I participated. So of course the first presentation was fantastic. No, I really enjoyed it. No. I shouldn't be saying anything on that, but I can make some broader points about what can we expect about the future and where can we go from what we have seen unfolding in the last 2 years. How can we see the future? But let me first say that I really enjoyed very much those presentations, and I really liked your attention to detail and because the work with the big data and putting the fertility picture together in a very detailed perspective. I really enjoyed that. Now, I start with Yeonjeong. You look properly at different things which you can look at with this monthly data at age, parity, education, social status. There was one thing which kind of made me curious because the Korean decline in birth started already in October 2020, very clearly and very strongly. And you argued this is because the pandemic started already in January 2020. This is different from Europe. In Europe, we really feel that the whole thing started in full swing in March 2020. This is the time when the governments started with the lockdowns, where significant number of people were getting infected. Until March, for Europeans, that was a kind of exotic disease happening in China, and after China, a little bit in some other countries. So did you really feel the start of the first wave in Korea, or that something is happening which would change people's behaviors already in January 2020? The other curious thing is that you show quite clearly that when one accounts for the pre-pandemic trends, which was kind of gradual decline in fertility, which was already so low that no one expected it could decline more, the pandemic didn't change the picture overall when we forget about the monthly fluctuations. But then you have these small snapshots of monthly changes which are going down in several periods. So it's interesting that the overall impact is not really visible, but these monthly trends for three selected periods show declines. And then you show which age groups are hit. And this leads me to one more comment, that is the role of government policies. I think that's something which we need to explore much more, looking at cross-country data. So when we look at European countries, we generally had increasing numbers of births during the pandemic, at least until the end of the year 2021. Which countries are these? These are countries with secure economic conditions for the population, but these are also countries where governments provide generous support to family policies. So the combination of generous family policies and good economic situation made it relatively easy for a number of Swedish mothers, Finnish mothers, Dutch mothers, and mothers in some other countries to have another child during the pandemic. And again, especially among the better educated. So I'm wondering whether there was any role of government policies in Korea, and what could government do also to smooth the ending of the pandemic, and to think how to take some messages home from the pandemic. Would it be, for instance, good if Korean government started supporting more flexibility in homework? If parents had more opportunities to stay at home and work from home? Or is it something bad because there is such a huge gender inequality that homework would mean that all the burden of care would fall on the shoulders of women and actually would be counterproductive? My favorite question is, Korean fertility is so low, can it still go lower? Because that's also a very kind of East Asian thing, the connection between marriage and fertility. In Europe, we had a big decline in marriage rates. We had some months in many countries where people are not really able to marry because there was a limit to wedding ceremonies. You could have so few guests or almost no guests that no one was marrying in some months. In some months, the registration of marriages was not even possible. But we don't think this will have a much impact on fertility rates because about half of childbearing in many European countries occurs outside of marriage. But in Korea, where there is a strong connection between marriage and first birth, do you expect that first birth would be depressed in the next 2 to 3 years? I think you have suggested that this is quite likely. Would it mean that Korean TFR would be 0.7 or more headlines for the newspapers? So a lot of interesting thoughts. Also how fertility trends are affected by policies, economic situation, and differentiated by social status. One last point about fertility. It's interesting that surveys in Korea, in Europe, often show that quite a number of people suggested that they want to postpone childbearing in uncertain times. We had seen it even stronger in places like Italy. We had seen the same thing in the US, where in the peak of the first wave in the US, about close to 1/3, about 27% of women said they decided to postpone childbearing because of the pandemic. Now you look at the data 1 year later, and US actually had more births during the pandemic than before the pandemic. It wasn't a big difference, but if you would believe surveys of fertility intentions at the start of the pandemic, you would expect something big will happen. Huge downturn in fertility rates. It didn't. And Korea is a little bit similar from the responses of women or couples. You would expect that there would be more decline than was actually observed. So that it's like an interesting observation. I don't know whether you have an explanation on that. As I said, I really enjoyed your talk. I'm not an expert so much on mobility, so I will have fewer comments and fewer questions. But still, I do have some. It's really great to see that you can use big data from mobile phone networks to the extent of really looking at granularity, not only in terms of how people move in smaller geographical units, districts, or even smaller units, but also what type, that you can try to distinguish what type of commuting changes, what kind of mobility changes. And maybe just a general comment about this first premise that urban density is potentially leading to more coronavirus death and more COVID infections. I think it really depends. We have seen some of this evidence being questioned in Europe, I think, because the thing is that also more testing happens in cities. And sometimes we saw that more COVID cases were reported in big cities with high density, but more excess deaths in some countries occurred in more rural regions. maybe also because people in cities were more complying with this putting on the masks, social distancing measures. It's just an anecdotal observation, but as someone who has a house in the countryside, a weekend house, I saw that people in the countryside were quite careless about anything like that, at least in some places, which I know. Now, thinking about the mobility, I was also thinking whether you can distinguish even more in detail how much mobility changes in terms of people who are staying in the area. So who are, staying overnight in different parts of Seoul. Whether some people have moved away from Seoul, for instance, during the pandemic and then returned back. How much mobility changes in terms of people who commute to cities? I think you did quite a bit of that, and how much mobility changes because people move differently around. But you have very nicely actually done this effort to distinguish different parts of mobility. And then I'm thinking about the future. I think Seoul is very different, but in the US there was a lot of discussion that many people moved quite permanently away from places like New York City because they had enough of city life. They had enough of all the troubles of commuting, then comes the pandemic, all the difficulties. So cities have difficulties now collecting taxis. Many services in cities and restaurants and bars are struggling because they don't have enough consumers, enough patrons to continue functioning. So it suggests that there is a longer term change which goes well beyond the waves of the pandemic, and where mobility is changed for good, maybe because many companies allow people working from home. Do you expect something like that happening in the context of Korea, or do you think that now mobility is back to where it was and nothing much happened in a long-term perspective? So what do you think about the future? Thank you.
Thank you.
Next discussion is Sean.
Okay, thank you for your great presentation, and I'd like to give a common question to Dr. Thomas and Dr. Sin regarding the fertility. So, because the European countries and Korea also experienced a long-term decline in the fertility, so I don't know whether we can distinguish whether the negative, the impact is came from the COVID-19 or just a long trend. Because, of course, Dr. Thomas, your time series analysis shows us there is a significant decrease. But I don't know whether it can be said to other countries or not is one of my questions. So it's same for our urban mobility because it is also have a long-term trend. So I wonder we can do it or not. And the other thing is that, as Dr. Thomas pointed out, the COVID-19 gives us two opportunities. One is positive, one is negative. We have extra time and increase the birth rate. But negative is economic concerns or infection concerns. Of course, my family is one of the family to discuss about my family plans because of COVID-19. So I don't know, in order to increase one of our aim is that how we can increase the fertilities in Korea or in European cities. Then in that case, I don't know, this opportunity of COVID-19 can be utilized as find which one is critical factors for the fertility. For example, we need more time or we need more money. I don't know which one is necessary. So according to that, our policies for the future may be different. So if you have any idea for that social structures or some welfare system is problem or some economic situation of the young age is problem of that, then if we can get some idea from this data, it may be very helpful for our future planning for increasing the mortality and solve the problem of the decreasing population in Korea. And then to Dr. Thomas, I have a question about the mortality. And so, of course, COVID-19 is one of the reasons to increasing the mortality during the pandemic. So, but the other idea is that because of COVID-19, the medical system for other diseases also corresponds during the COVID-19. So I don't know if we think about our future, next pandemic or like that, we need to discuss about not just COVID-19, but also we have both infection disease and general disease. The medical system is one critical point to do that. So do you have any idea how we can distinguish between the COVID-19 related deaths and the non-COVID-19 related deaths? So it may be helpful to discuss how we can prepare our medical system for after next COVID-19. Then to the Dr. Sin, and I'd like to hear about more detail about data. So because of the decrease of the mortalities shows a great in the month with a small number of the births. I don't know whether the sample size or the small number can be one of the reasons for the great decrease, because small number shows a great decrease, even the 1 or 2% decrease. So I don't know whether there is possibility of data problem or data limitation about that point. And this is my questions to presenters. So let's move on to the Dr. Kim. Thank you for your great presentation. I always love the framework, the centripetal and centrifugal. Yeah, this is very good idea. I also agree with that. So my first question is maybe same question to me, whether centralized or decentralized or is in South Korea is my question. So based on your data, what is your conclusion in the current situation? More dependence on the Seoul or distributed? So there's one of the discussion regarding new town in Korea and Japan, because the Korea new town have a more functions such as the business or the other system within the cities, more they do not have to go outside because there is job. But in many new town in Japan, it's very high dependence on the Tokyo area. So I don't know what is your current conclusion, whether it's centralized or decentralized. And then it may be a technical question for the network. Is it directed network or non-directed network for your that one? So if it is non-direct, can you give an answer for this point one now? Directed. Okay. So if then I don't know what I question about the negative, the effect of flex of O, because D may be the high number of persons who do not have to go there is a possible, I can understand, but what the reasons for the minus coefficient of the O, if you have some ideas, I'd like to hear the answer for that. Then the final is that in your long-term analysis, there was some trouble between the home to home. So please let me check whether here the first home is city level. 시군구. Both are neighborhood level. Oh. If then, so I wonder that here I find a similar trend in Japan. So because the short distance travel increased, but we don't know because the mobility data do not know whether they are staying there or move just short within the same dome. So there's two possible answers. One is that just increase number of stay home. Second one is the increase of the visitor to the destination, neighborhood, the commercial area. So I want to know what is your idea for interpreting this conclusion. Thank you for your presentation.
It is always difficult to define mobility. Okay. How long you going to stay there? How far you go, and so and so. Well, I think we've got a lot of great questions and comments, but it's not always easy to provide great answers to that in a very short time. Good luck, Thomas. You're the first.
Okay, your first question is that the European people in European countries worry about the impact of the COVID-19 start from the March in 2020, but in Korea, actually, the COVID-19 started to spread from the Wuhan, China. And when the COVID-19 spread from Wuhan, China, many people, Korean people, worry so much about the COVID-19 because there are many Chinese people come to Korea, and there are debate whether we are not make some restriction for the inflow of many restriction for the inflow of the Chinese people. So I think the fear for the COVID-19 was greater in the first stage of the spread of COVID-19. And at the time, actually, the number of infections, number of cases is very, there are very small number of cases, but at the time it was a big, people worried so much about the spread of COVID-19 in Korea. So I think the impact of the COVID-19, I think it started from the January 2020 in Korea. And your next, the second question is, second question is, what is the government, the impact of government policy? You said that TFR of Korea didn't much decrease during the period of pandemic, and you are thinking about, you told me it can be the impact of the government policy. But even before the government policy, even before the COVID-19, Korean government expanded the family policies, but it doesn't make any. But it doesn't make any. But it doesn't work. TFR of Korea still decreased even for the government expansion for the family policy. And I think government policy does not much work for the TFR of Korea. And actually, after the COVID-19, flexible work and work at home became normal in Korea. But right now, I think at the time we just tried, we return to the previous life of the COVID-19. And actually, I enjoyed the telework and work at home during the period of COVID-19. But right now, many companies just go back to the previous lives. So I think, and only very limited women can benefit from the kind of telework and flexible work. So I think government policy did not much influence on the TFR of Korea during the pandemic. And your next question is that you said that TFR of Korea will be 0.7 in the near future, and actually the statistics of Korea estimate that TFR of Korea could be 0.7 in 2003 or in the 2023 or 2024. So I think TFR may be decreased to 0.7, and it will surprise the world again. And you said that postponement of childbirth, and I did the study for the postponement of the childbearing, and in the European women just postpone, and many people realize their childbirth. But in Korea, they just postpone and just give up. Many women postpone, and there are a very small number of women realize their childbirth. So I think it's a very different situation. The Korean situation is very different from the European countries. Okay, and I think I answered. I think my response is. I think response is. Good. I think that's all my response for your comment. Thank you.
Thomas, would you like
Yes,
to next?
thank you.
Yeah.
So I try to be relatively short. How do we know that fertility declines because of COVID and not because of something else? We have two cues. One is that I didn't show it because I didn't have much time, but we run projection model based on ARIMA program, where we stop everything when we stop birth trends in October 2020. So except in Korea, in most countries, this is October, we count October 20 as pre-COVID period. And then we get a projection, what would be the birth trends based on also knowing the seasonality, how things fluctuate every month, this 90 and 95% confidence intervals in the next 1 or 2 years. And then we compare these trends with the actual projected trends with the actual trends. And we see that the actual trends get outside of this confidence interval much more frequently than in 10 or 5% cases. And that gives us cues in which countries and which months the birth trends differed from the projected ones. And we see that there are clear waves, which also suggest that there is an impact of COVID. Almost everywhere, births are going down around December 2020, January 21. That's the first wave. Almost everywhere, birth trends recover around March 2021, which are births conceived around June, July 2020, when some people naively were thinking that COVID is over after the first wave, that we are done with the COVID. And then suddenly we see many countries dropping in January 22 after some recoveries in many of them. And this is actually, I forgot to discuss that as a teaser. We are discussing this with my colleagues. Is this the effect of vaccination? Not in the sense of people getting infertile by the vaccine, but perhaps women trying to avoid getting pregnant just out of precaution around the time they get their first and second dose. Maybe some women were also not feeling absolutely great after the vaccination, so also not a great time to have sex and conceive a baby. Or is it something else? Because it's also the time when, especially in many places in Europe, all the lockdowns are over, people return back to work, they start getting busy social life again, so not really having time or thinking about having kids. So we are thinking of ways how to distinguish these two effects and how to study these declines a little bit more. What do we learn from the COVID period from policies? Well, we learned things which we mostly know already, that it's important to have good economic support for families. Economic uncertainty is never good for conceiving babies. So countries like Italy or Spain, which suffered a lot of increase in unemployment in the first wave of the COVID, or where the governments were not able to prevent economic uncertainty, they had this initial bigger decline in birth rates. Countries which get more government support and where couples had safer position were doing better in birth trends. But also, maybe we learned one more thing, that policies need to support flexibility. That it's not government doing one type of policies, it should be the couples who have flexibility to decide about maybe partly working from home if their profession allows, decide about the length of their parental leave, decide about childcare options, these countries are then better weathering the crises or difficult situations. Now, jumping to mortality, how can we know that excess deaths are COVID deaths or non-COVID deaths? I think there is a lot of evidence that most excess deaths which we observed in the first 2 years of the pandemic are really COVID-related deaths. And one piece of evidence which really suggests that is that in countries where the evidence of COVID cases is not very good, the excess deaths waves are very closely overlapping with the waves of the reported COVID deaths and reported COVID infections. So it really seems that most of these excess deaths are just unreported COVID-related deaths. But of course, then there are deaths which are somehow maybe due to neglected healthcare, postponed operations, and or health systems being under complete strain. And that leads to some speculation about the future. Actually, we don't know whether mortality rates will recover after COVID and go back to the trajectory where they were before, or whether mortality will now stagnate and will not improve so much, because you can have arguments on both sides. Maybe some of you know the harvesting theory in mortality. The harvesting hypothesis would suggest that the frail people have now died, or the frailest people have died, and those who survived the pandemic are a bit healthier, so life expectancy will now shoot through the ceiling and recover very nicely, because the healthier will not now be dying so much in the next 1 or 2 years. But we also have the neglected healthcare, people waiting much longer for the surgeries. Some healthcare systems in some countries still very badly affected by the experience of the COVID. And we also don't know what happens with long COVID. That's a big bit of discussion in Europe. Do many people suffer health-related problems in the next year or two because they have long COVID, consequences of long COVID? So it's an open question. Yes, please. So I'm done with my comments or responses. Thanks.
The doing that section in the United States, we look at each specific mortality rate, you see that it's very much different. The youngest group, I think, has the issue to actually have higher rates. And it seems that unlikely that the biological is explaining that. So we could see that we observe that mortality rate actually actually has a non-COVID component.
Yes, that's very likely. We had the United States differing quite a lot in their mortality trends from other highly developed countries already before the coronavirus period, partly due to a lot of deaths due to drug overdose or deaths which are affecting younger age groups. So I'm not a mortality expert, but I would expect that some of this is also happening during the COVID period. Deaths from external causes or deaths from drug misuse, maybe some other causes as well, which are not related to COVID, have possibly increased because of the stress and the strain of the pandemic as well.
Okay, done. Okay, thank you. Before asking Dr. Kim to respond to the comment and questions, I would like to share a couple of my slides, which shows the fluctuations in the number of births at very early stage of the corona outbreak in Korea. Would you please? I have no doubt that there was an initial kind of pandemic sharp huge drop in Spanish fertility from December 2020 to January 2021, if I remember correctly. Is that right, Thomas? Yeah. All right. It seems that we often tend to overestimate the impact of COVID-19 to some degree. If you take a look at this slide, you can see a substantial drop in the number of births in November and December 2020, which has been interpreted as initial pandemic shock. Okay? But exactly a year later, in November and December 21, there was another huge drop in the number of births. And now it is difficult to define whether it was due to the pandemic or seasonality or something else. Okay. Besides, if you take a look at the same data from different angle, would you go on? Yes. On the next slide, we do not see market drops in the number of births due to the pandemic. So I feel like it depends on how you make adjustment for calendar or seasonality or something else in your model, ARIMA or whatever. Okay? So result could be different according to the adjustment you made when you work on your data. So this morning we talked about we tend to exaggerate the negative outcome of COVID-19 on mortality, but same is true to some degree on fertility as well. That's one of my comments. Any objections to that? If you take a look at the European data, you may have different idea about ownership there because you have more number of cases in more countries and so on. So you are in a better position to generalize.
Actually, I would say that we are trying to be relatively careful not to overestimate the impact of the COVID. But the biggest surprises in Europe were the unexpected increase in the number of births in many countries somewhere in the middle of the pandemic. Mm-hmm. We didn't expect that in places like Austria, Czechia, Finland, the Netherlands, people still struggling with the second and third wave of the coronavirus pandemic would suddenly perhaps got so much used to the pandemic that many of them had babies to the extent that fertility rates started increasing temporarily. Mm-hmm. And then I want to emphasize again how humble we should be in our projections, because I didn't know a single demographer who would predict the 2022 fertility decline. Mm-hmm. We predicted a lot of things. Some demographers predicted long-term decline from the start of the pandemic. Some demographers predicted some recovery. But that suddenly, when we thought we know a lot of things about the pandemic and how it affects birth trends, that places where it didn't affect until then went down, like Germany, maybe just for half a year, we don't know yet, but clearly a clear downward trend. No one of us predicted it. And it means that we have to be also not only careful, but humble in saying what happens in the future, because sometimes we are not good in predicting the future.
All right. Thank you, Thomas. Now, why don't I ask Dr. Kim to respond to the comment and questions he received?
Hey, first of all, thank you for all of your input, suggestions, and comments and questions. Oh, yeah, I received a lot. But I think I'm not the only one who are waiting for the dinner, so I will do as quick as possible. So, I really appreciate Thomas for a great question. So, I think, I need more close investigation on who are staying and what kind of places they are staying. So, which means the demographics of mobility, like age and sex groups. Actually, the big data has information on that. So, I think that is what I expect to learn from you and all other demographers in this group. So I'm very looking forward to the next work. I'm doing with you guys. And I think the characteristics of neighborhood, characteristics of spaces will be also considered. So in that sense, I need some sort of classification. And then Dr. Eom's application of decision tree gave me a big inspiration for me. Okay. And then, does the mobility level go back to the normal? Before the pre-COVID level, or that will lead to the permanent migration? That is a very big question. So, but the thing is that the research which can answer the question will bring me to another stage of research, because that relates to the property market because, migration, internal migration in South Korea very, very relates to the property market. And then not only property market, but also connect with interest rate and then macroeconomics. So it's like what Dr. Shin said. Yeah, it's a very complex decision-making process of where you will live. So, but I'm still thinking of the big question, and that will be my kind of next work to do. I definitely need many steps to get there. Then, to answer Dr. Ohm's question, in the short term, I believe that there was a stronger centrifugal force than centripetal force. So there was a kind of power outward. So many people got a chance to do remote working and different kinds of options for their scheduling. But in the long term, I'm not sure about that. So that is the reason I try to compare the purposes of travel so I can find small evidences. So for example, mobility from home to home recovered earlier than other purposes and even surpassed the level of the pre-COVID period. So that will be my small answer to your big question. And then, your last suggestion and comment was really great. Yes, the mobility from home to home can be either staying home or travel in short distance. So I really need to ask the data provider, Katie, what algorithm was used to distinguish daytime and nighttime location in more details. Thank you.
According to the program of this seminar, we are supposed to have a session which is called conclusion and closing. Do we have to? Are we supposed to finish everything by 6 o'clock, or we still a little bit? All right, okay. Trust me, they're going to have a lot of comments and remarks. Well, then I'm very happy to invite volunteers who are willing to give some final remarks or any kinds of comment on any of the presentations made today. Okay? Any policy implications we learned from this seminar, any new methodological issue, or any suggestions for the next collaboration, anything? Any volunteers? Go ahead.
I just want to say thank you first for the ability to be here, and I think I learned a lot from hearing about the Korean case, and I'm not sure whether this constitutes what you had in mind for concluding remarks, but I wanted to say that I was really struck by the finding that you had about the age differences in terms of the change number of babies, because it's really something that hasn't been investigated enough in at least in the Singaporean case, and I was really struck by the rise of babies to women 40 and above. That really amazed me, because that would have been totally counter to my predictions. Because I would have thought that reproductive health, and in the case of older women, they're more likely to require assisted reproductive services. That they actually had a 60% jump in number of births. And so that was something that I was really struck by and thought was really interesting.
I used the raw data from the viral statistics in 2020, and we didn't get any raw data from the 2021. If we can get the 2021, I think I can produce more research about differences by socioeconomic groups, differences by socioeconomic groups. It's just the first stage of the spread of COVID-19. But I think we should look at more recent data. And maybe they will release the data in end of this year. So maybe I will produce more research in this end of this year.
I would like to thank again for Kiasa for arranging this wonderful and very beneficial meeting. One of the key takeaways for me personally, and maybe for others, is as Professor Sobotka said, that to be more humble in the analysis, in presenting the analysis. And earlier today, Professor Gietel-Basten also said to be more careful in associating one thing with another, especially in COVID, where we think we know about COVID, but then many things come up and surprise us. So I think that's two of the key takeaways in this session. And another one is the use of big data is, I think the prospect of big data is really, really bright, especially in Indonesia. We in my institution, we have received trainings about big data, and hopefully in the future we can utilize cell phone data and also other social media data to make to conduct studies related to demography. I think it's very potential. So thank you.
Last volunteer. Okay.
No.
You don't. You will have a chance to
Last comment.
something.
Okay.
Say
For the last
something
comment.
right? Okay. Yeah. Anyone? Yes.
Yeah, it was very useful for me. Instead to make some answers for the learnings. I actually learned many questions from these symposiums, and it raised many research questions. And based on this, I will make further research. Because I think we are still on the way of the pandemic, and there are so many things we make some contribution to our society by academia. So I think these will guide us the future study. Thank you.
Thank you. This seminar, I've been retired like 5 years ago, but this seminar was a kind of rewarding experience for me, and I learned a lot today. Then I asked myself, what are the lessons we got for the future research and policies? Before closing this session, I would like to share one of my slides. Could you please, which contains a list of questions that I used to ask myself at the end of seminar or conference. I don't mean to get into the details of these questions, but I would suggest you just take a simple look at the list of questions briefly. Though countries or regions of our concern today share a great deal of common factors in the direction of demographic change, they are different in their socio-political or economic environment, and there exist substantial differences in the degree of main focus and priority of prevention policies. So we still have a lot to learn about the demographic impact of COVID-19 from the good and bad experience of other countries. So we need to stay connected and continue our good work together to the next step. So now I would like to ask Dr. Shin to say a few words about our plan after the seminar. How are you going to make a use of all the papers you collected today, and do you have any plan for the joint project or any next round of meeting or anything, it's a closing remark for you.
I don't want to make any administrative things as a final remark. I just
No need to be too cautious about it. Nobody is going to talk about it to your president.
actually I thank for the participant for this seminar. Actually, this is the first international offline seminar after the spread of COVID-19. So when I prepare for this seminar, there are many skepticism about this seminar really work, but it make. So I really appreciate for all the participants for this seminar, especially for Thomas, the successful transit in the Munich airport. So I would like to give my special thanks to my Korean colleague, Professor Choi, Professor Kye, and Professor Kim, and all of them are my colleagues, and I really thank to their very wonderful research and their presentation. And I really happy that we gathered together the European researchers and researchers in the East Asia and the Asian countries, and I'm very happy we work together for this seminar. And I think, I hope this seminar just starts a new beginning of international cooperative work after the COVID-19. And I hope we continue to work, and I hope everybody continue to work with Kiasa. And I also thank to my research assistant, especially Subin Ellis-Bach. She did a lot of efforts to make this seminar, and let's give her a big applause. And I also thank to my research assistant, Hee-sun Jung, and my assistant, Jae-man Im, all of them, all of their effort to help this seminar. So let's give them a big applause. Okay. And also, I would like to give my special thanks to the Professor Kim. And
It was my pleasure.
and I think I'm very happy
Okay. Thank you.
for the successful
Well, let me put it this way. You will be informed once the next project or next meeting becomes more feasible. I just hope that we will have another opportunity to meet with each other or work together, not to find the future. Okay. On behalf of this is just 6 o'clock, so I'll try to be punctual. On behalf of Kiasa and the organizer of this seminar, I would like to thank all the people in this room, speakers, discussing participants, staff members who made today's seminar possible. So why don't we give our big hands to ourselves and to all the people, especially Ms. Park, for the time. Do you have any announcement to make after this, before I close this session? All right. Then it's about time to finish this seminar. I'm very happy to declare that the seminar on global demographic change after COVID-19, organized by Kihasa, is closed now. Thank you all, and stay healthy. And for those of you from abroad, safe return home, and we will keep in touch. Okay? Thank you very much. Thank you all.